support the action against Israel for the genocide it is committing in Gaza. People before Prophet were the first party to bring the Genocide Convention into the Dáil in November, and the government voted at that time against a request that they would initiate proceedings under the Genocide Convention. Last week they voted against the Soc Dem motion calling for Ireland to support South Africa's action. It'll be interesting to see what they do. It is clear that they are under enormous pressure from public anger in this country. Their rhetoric has shifted from trying to undermine the South Africans by querying whether a genocide was an appropriate word to describe what Israel was doing, to now we hear ministers at the weekend talking about hoping that the government will join the case. So we hope the government will finally do the right thing. I was talking to a former South African MP, also interestingly an ANC MP from Jewish extraction, who at the weekend he was just saying how proud he was as a South African and a member of the Jewish community that a country that had been victims of colonialism and apartheid were the ones to lead the world in calling Israel out for genocide. Well, frankly, given our history of colonialism and suffering under similar laws to the apartheid laws in the form of the penal laws, it is shameful that the Irish government have not stood with South Africa against the Gaza genocide being committed by Israel, and we hope finally they will do that today. We are also going to add an amendment to the Sinn Féin motion, which essentially points out that all, and this is a point we've been trying to make since November when we first brought this up, is it's not just about accountability for genocide after the fact. The Genocide Convention confers on all states who are made aware of the possibility that a genocide may be taking place to use all measures within their power to prevent the commission of that genocide. The case law in the court is very, very clear. This was said very clearly, for example, in the Bosnia-Serbia case, that signatories have an obligation to take all measures in their power to prevent the commission of genocide. That means the Irish government should be imposing sanctions. It means that the European Union should not be, any of the European states who are signatories should not be still continuing to send arms to Israel to commit what we now have been told by the World Court is a possible or very seriously plausible case of genocide. And similarly, the United States. And by the way, that leads then into the Patrick's Day thing. I mean, genocide is the worst crime human beings can commit. So the idea that any Irish political representative, Taoiseach, minister, or other political representatives would glad hand the US president, when he is deeply implicated in arming a state to commit what is very seriously possibly a genocide. We believe it is a genocide, but where the court has said it might be genocide, for the Irish government to glad hand the president who's doing that would be shameful, utterly shameful. And I think people will be held to account by the Irish public if they go over glad handing somebody who's implicated in a genocide. Very last point, this might seem trivial, but I do just want to mention it, is people may have seen the reports that the US Embassy is moving across the road to Jury's Hotel. Now, the Jury's Hotel complex is a scandal. It has been sitting there empty in the teeth of a massive housing and accommodation crisis for a decade, and none of us could quite figure out what was going on. Because that is a strategically important site where you would imagine in the face of a housing crisis, those buildings would have been used for emergency accommodation, or that it would be redeveloped to develop things like public and affordable housing. And we now discover instead it's going to be used for a US embassy when they have a perfectly good building across the road and there's a surplus of office space. So that sale has not gone through, and I really think we should do everything to stop that. And by the way, directly across the road from that is the former Israeli embassy, a 7-story building, also sitting empty in the teeth of a housing and refugee crisis. And no sign that the building is going to be redeveloped. So as well as everything else Israel and the United States is doing, it would appear they have helped contribute to a housing crisis, or at least failing to address a housing crisis that's having such a negative impact in this country.
Richard, have people for profit have had any engagement from Micheál Martin since Friday? He has said he's had some preliminary legal advice on joining the case, and that it's complex, and he would be speaking to opposition parties.
I am blue in the face asking Micheál Martin since November, I want to repeat, where I read out during the motion in November our obligations. And it's absolutely clear at this point that the Irish government are trying to obfuscate and throw sand in people's eyes about their real obligations under this convention. Because it's not that complicated. And anybody can look at the case law in the World Court, at the convention itself. It confers very specific obligations on a state to prevent the commission of genocide, including unilateral action. Right? It is required. I mean, it's obvious, isn't it? A genocide is the worst thing human beings could do to each other. So anybody who signs the convention has an obligation to try and stop it. And yet, the European Union continues to arm the state. We continue to treat it from a diplomatic and political point of view as if it's a normal state. The United States continues to send them arms, in fact, increase the delivery of arms to a state that the court is now saying is likely committing genocide. By the way, that also then, because the convention is also very clear about complicity, now that the court has put the world on notice that a genocide may be taking place, anybody who assists in that genocide is complicit under the terms of the Genocide Convention. And that's a very, very serious responsibility that all European states, including ours, should bear in mind.
Was there no engagement since Friday now?
Not since Friday. Not since a very tetchy engagement in the Dáil on Thursday. So it's clear Micheál Martin is feeling pretty defensive about this. I don't know if you saw his performance, but he put it on social media indeed. But I had a very tetchy engagement with him in the Dáil. But really, all he did was attack the opposition and said very little about his legal responsibilities.
Okay, we have a legal responsibility tomorrow. We have private members' time, and we are bringing forward a bill to amend, and it's a short bill, but it'll amend the Misuse of Drugs Act as proposed by Gino Kenny, who's not here because he had to go to a funeral. And so on his behalf, I just want to explain the bill and say that the Misuse of Drugs Act, if this gets passed, will be amended, and it's in line with what the Citizens' Assembly on Drugs recently advocated for, which is that when there's a small amount of cannabis being used for personal use, in this case it's 7 grams, that the response of the society should not be to criminalise people who have small amounts of cannabis for personal use, but rather to offer them help and support if they have a problem. But most people who smoke a bit of cannabis don't have a health problem. Some do misuse it to a degree that's not good for their health. But it has been proven over the decades that criminalising people for small amounts of personal use of drugs of any sort, but in this case of cannabis, is counterproductive. It gives them a record that stays with them for life and lessens their chances of being able to progress themselves, and it uses up both court time and space in prisons. Instead of treating it as a social issue and a health issue, it's always been treated as a criminal issue. So this small amendment tomorrow will be brought before the Dáil by people before profit, and we really hope that the government are not going to oppose it and will just let it go ahead. And you can all have a joint next week out in the plinth.
Ask Dutchy on the left hand side.
That'd be Swift.
Swift.
Yes. I want to talk about the prosecutions for non-payment of TV licenses. Yesterday it emerged that in the second half of last year, over 8,000 prosecutions were issued. That's an increasing figure. There was about 6,000 in the first half of last year. And we're now at a rate of 60 a day and going up. People being prosecuted for non-payment of TV license. When you look at the figures, it looks like a majority of people are boycotting the TV license at this stage. That obviously is a figure that shot up in the aftermath of the controversy about Ryan Tubridy and the flip-flops and the culture that existed at the top of RTE. You're talking about jamming up the courts with these massive prosecutions. You're talking about people being faced with a €1,000 fine or a jail time for non-payment. And all of this when there's a debate in government, and the Taoiseach himself has now come out and said he wants rid of this TV licence before the next general election and replace with a direct model of exchequer funding. So immediately we're saying there must be an amnesty for non-payment of the TV licence. The TV licence is a regressive, unjust tax. The richest family in the country and the poorest family in the country that is eligible is all faced with paying the same amount of €160 a year. And instead we've set out quite a detailed proposal of RTE for the people, how you could fund and increase funding for proper public service broadcasting by taxing the big social media giants who effectively are parasites on much of our media ecosystem and siphon off a lot of the advertising and so on. So it makes sense to tax them, to use that to invest in public service broadcasting. So there needs to be an amnesty. We need to stop prosecuting people for not paying the TV licence, and the TV licence needs to be scrapped.
You're saying people shouldn't be prosecuted for breaking the law?
People should not be prosecuted for not paying the TV licence.
They're breaking the law.
People who refused to pay the water charges were breaking the law. The consequence was not that they were...
It's different though, because the licence has been in existence for 100 years. That was a new tax.
But across Europe, actually, a whole number of countries have moved over the past 5 years to scrap TV licence. That's the direction things are going. We think that people are absolutely justified to see this as an unjust tax. People are justified to engage in protest in the context of what they saw in RTE. And like a majority of people, if you look at the figures, look like they're currently boycotting. So that's also a democratic act that people are engaged in. It's an act of civil disobedience that people are engaged in. We defeated the water charges by people refusing to pay the water charges, and people are currently refusing to pay the TV licence. So the government should read the writing on the wall on this one, as opposed to pursuing this issue right up to the general election and beyond. It's really not a good idea for them.
Public service broadcasting?
100%. We're the ones who propose a significant increase in funding for public service broadcasting, but the poorest family in the country shouldn't be. What did I say?
The only ones.
Yeah, we're the only ones. The poorest families in the country should not be paying the same as the richest families in the country.
Paul just commented that the issue
Yep.
yesterday announcing the ban of disposable vapes.
Yep.
Vape happening in Ireland. There's government driving the beat on this issue.
Yes, we should be banning disposable vapes. I mean, it is crazy that rare materials are being dug up out of